I've been sitting here so long, the ice in this glass melted down to nothing. Just water now. Room's quiet the way it gets at 2 in the morning, when the neighborhood finally stops pretending to be awake. I can hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen. I can hear my own breathing. That's about all there is tonight, and some nights that's enough to make a man feel very small, very old, very far from everything he used to be. I'm 81 years old. I don't say that to ask for anything. I don't need your sympathy. I just need you to understand that when I talk about these things, I'm talking about a long time ago, and I'm also talking about yesterday. That's the strange thing about getting old. Time doesn't arrange itself the way you think it will. You think you'll remember things in order. You think the years will sit in neat rows like chairs in a church. But they don't. They pile on top of each other. They bleed into each other. Something that happened 40 years ago can feel closer than something that happened last Thursday. So I'll just talk. I'll just let it come, the way it comes. Her name was Evelyn. Evelyn Marie. She had a way of saying my name, Clarence, where the second syllable dropped just slightly, like a note sliding down a scale. Only a few people in my life ever said my name and made it sound like it mattered. She was the first. She was the one I thought would always be the last. We were married for 22 years. 22 years is a long time. People hear that and they nod like they understand. But I don't think they do. Not really. 22 years is 2 decades of learning another person's rhythms. It's knowing when she's tired before she says it. It's knowing which silences are peaceful and which ones are dangerous. It's morning breath and arguments about money and the way the bed dips on her side. It's your children growing up inside that time, like trees growing inside a fence, shaped by everything around them, whether they know it or not. I worked. Lord, I worked. I drove trucks for 16 of those 22 years. Long haul. I was gone sometimes 4, 5 days at a stretch. I'd come home, and the house would feel like I was a visitor in it, like the furniture had rearranged itself just slightly, like the air had settled into patterns that didn't quite include me. I never complained about that. I thought providing was enough. I thought if the lights were on, and the refrigerator was full, and the school shoes fit, that I was doing what a man was supposed to do. I was wrong about that. I know that now. I don't know what I would have done differently. I don't know that I had a choice about the truck driving. The other jobs I tried didn't pay near enough. And we had 2 boys to raise, Marcus and Darnell, 2 years apart. Marcus the older one, Darnell the younger. They were good boys. I want to say that clearly. Whatever happened between me and their mother, those were good boys. I take some credit for that, and I take some blame for what they became in other ways, the parts of themselves that learned to be cold from watching their father be absent. You can't be gone that much and not leave a shape in the room. An absence has a shape. Children feel it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, or maybe behind myself. It doesn't matter. The marriage started falling apart long before either one of us admitted it. That's how these things go. You don't wake up one morning and it's broken. It's more like a sweater that you keep wearing, and every time you wash it, something loosens a little, and you don't notice because you're looking at other things. And then one day you put it on and the whole thing just pulls apart in your hands. Evelyn started going to this church, new congregation, new pastor, big building over on Clement Street. She'd been raised Baptist, same as me, but this was something different. This was one of those places where the music was louder and the spirit was something you could see on people's faces. I went a few times with her. I sat in those pews and watched people cry and raise their hands, and I didn't feel what they felt. I wasn't going to pretend I did. I respected her faith. I just didn't share it in the same way. And somehow, that gap between us, which had always been there in some form, started to feel like a canyon. She made friends at that church, friends I didn't know, women who came over for dinner and talked about things I had no part of, men who became her spiritual advisors, her prayer partners. I wasn't jealous. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't jealous of any specific person. I was jealous of the whole world she was building that I wasn't in. I was jealous of the version of herself she was becoming, with other people watching. I came home from a long run up to Vancouver one November. I'd been gone 5 days. I came in the back door and set my bag down, and the house smelled like food I hadn't cooked and conversation I hadn't been part of. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She looked up when I walked in, and something passed across her face. Not joy, not irritation either. Something more like the expression you'd have if you looked up and realized you'd left the porch light on, like I was something she'd forgotten to account for. I ate dinner. I showered. I went to bed. She came to bed later, and we lay in the dark, and neither one of us said anything. And that silence was the loneliest I'd ever felt while lying next to another human being. We went on like that for probably 2 more years. I know people from the outside looking in probably wouldn't have seen it. We were civil. We were even kind sometimes. We raised our boys through that period. Marcus graduated high school. Darnell had his problems with school, but he got through. We had Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings and birthday cakes. We performed the marriage even when we'd stopped living inside it. It was me who finally said the word, divorce. I said it in April, a Tuesday. Nothing special about that Tuesday. No argument had preceded it. We'd had a quiet dinner, and she was washing the dishes, and I was drying them the way I always did, standing beside her, and I just said it. I said, Evelyn, I think we need to talk about whether this is still working. She didn't look at me. She kept washing that plate. She said, I've been thinking the same thing. That was the whole conversation. 2 sentences, 22 years. The divorce took almost 8 months to finalize. During those 8 months, we were strangely polite to each other, strangely careful, like people handling something fragile that they both knew was already broken. We didn't fight about money much. We didn't have much money to fight about. The house was underwater on the mortgage anyway. She kept it, took over the payments. I found an apartment 4 miles away. The boys were grown by then, more or less. Marcus was 23. Darnell was 21. They didn't take sides out loud, but I could feel the weight shift. I could feel them gravitating toward their mother the way water finds the lowest point. It made sense. She had the house, she had the church, she had the friends, and the community, and the life that was still intact. I had an apartment with a mattress on the floor for the first 3 weeks because I couldn't bring myself to go buy a bed frame. I want to talk about what happened next because I think it's important. After the divorce was final, I sat in that apartment for about 4 months. Just sat. I kept my truck driving job. I came home. I sat. I didn't drink. I want to be clear about that. I've never been a drinking man, but I sat in a way that was probably just as unhealthy. I sat and let the quiet fill me up like water fills a container, right to the brim. And then I made a decision. It wasn't impulsive. I'd been thinking about it for years, actually, long before the marriage fell apart. I had a cousin in Lyon, France. He'd moved there in the 90s with his wife, an Ivorian woman he'd met at a conference. He'd been writing to me for years, calling me, telling me to come visit. Come stay, he'd say. Come see something different. Come breathe some different air. I was 63 years old and divorced and sleeping in an apartment where the upstairs neighbor walked heavy. And I thought, why not? I gave my notice at the trucking company. I sold most of what I owned. I bought a one-way ticket. And I left. I want to be honest about what I expected from my boys when I told them. I expected protest. I expected, "Daddy, you can't just leave." I expected some version of pushback that would tell me they needed me here. That would tell me my presence on this earth, in this city, in this country, mattered to them in some concrete, daily way. Marcus took me to lunch at a diner near his job. He listened to me explain everything. He nodded. He said, "You sure about this?" I said yes. He said, "Well, I hope it does you good." And he picked up his fork and kept eating. Darnell was on the phone. He said, "That's a big move, Pop." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "You gonna be all right over there?" I said, "I believe so." He said, "All right then. Let me know when you land." That was it. That was my farewell. I'm not angry about it the way I used to be. I'm not. I've had enough years and enough distance to understand that they had their own lives, their own pain around the divorce, their own complicated feelings about a father who was gone more than he was present, even when he lived 5 miles away. I understand that. But I'll tell you, in those moments, sitting across from Marcus in that diner, I felt something in my chest that I couldn't name then and still struggle to name now. It was something like realizing you've been waiting your whole life for a door to open and finally accepting that it's not going to. I landed in Lyon on a Wednesday morning in October. I was 63 years old and I had 2 suitcases and enough savings to give myself a year to figure out what came next. I'm not going to talk too much about Lyon, because Lyon isn't really what this is about. But I'll say this, that city did something to me. The pace of it, the age of it, walking those streets and knowing that those stones had been there for centuries, that people had lived and argued and loved and died on those very spots long before anyone I'd ever known was born. It put things in perspective. It made me feel small in a way that was, strangely, a relief. Because if you're small, then your pain is also small, and if your pain is small, maybe it's survivable. I learned some French, not fluent, not by a long stretch, but enough to buy bread and ask directions and apologize when I bumped into someone. My cousin and his wife were generous people. They had me to dinner 2-3 times a week. They introduced me to their friends. They took me to the countryside once, driving through those fields with the lavender going purple all the way to the horizon. And I sat in the back seat of that car and cried quietly because it was so beautiful and because I had no one to share it with who would have known what it meant to me. But I was surviving. I was even, in moments, living. And then it was about 9 months after I arrived, and I got a call from Darnell. He didn't call to check on me. I want to be honest about that. He called because he had news. His mother was engaged. Evelyn was getting married. I sat with the phone against my ear, and I heard Darnell's voice explaining this to me. And the refrigerator in my Lyon apartment hummed, and the neighbor's dog barked twice down the hall, and the world kept going, in exactly the way the world does. I said, "Well, that's something." Darnell said, His name is Gerald Whitmore. He runs some kind of consulting firm. He's doing well. He's a good man. Mama seems happy. I said, I'm glad she's happy. And I meant it. I want to be careful here because I don't want to perform more grace than I actually had. I did mean that Evelyn deserved to be happy. I'd always believed that. But sitting there with the phone in my hand, I also felt something else, something underneath the genuine goodwill, something that had no clean name, something that lived in the territory between pride and grief and old loneliness. Then Darnell said the other thing. He said, Marcus and me, we're both going to be in the wedding party. Gerald asked us to stand up with him. And there it was. I said, oh. He said, yeah. Gerald's a good man, Pop. He's been good to us. He brought us fishing last summer, up in the mountains. He remembers our birthdays. He's just, he's present. Present. My son said that word to me on the phone from 9,000 miles away. Present. I let the word sit there in the air of my apartment. Didn't respond to it directly. I said, well, when is the wedding? He told me. About 3 months away. I said, where? He told me the name of the venue. One of those big event spaces they rent for things like that. Nice place by the water. I said, all right, son. Thank you for telling me. He said, you gonna be okay? I said, I'm always okay. He said, all right, Pop. We hung up. And I sat in my apartment in Lyon, and I thought about Gerald Whitmore, who ran a consulting firm and went fishing with my sons and remembered their birthdays and was present. I want to tell you what I did in those 3 months, because this is where the story gets complicated, because this is where I did something that I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since, asking myself whether it was dignity or vanity, whether it was strength or pettiness, whether I'm proud of it or ashamed of it. And the honest answer, the one I've arrived at after all these years, is that it was all of those things at once. Man is rarely just one thing, and a moment is rarely just one feeling. I had money, not Gerald Whitmore money. I want to be clear about that. But in the years I'd been in Lyon, I'd been living simply, and I'd done some investment consulting work through a friend of my cousin's, mostly reviewing logistics contracts, work I knew from decades of trucking, and I'd saved more than I'd spent. I'd also, through a series of what I can only call fortunate decisions, and one very well-timed sale of some property I'd held as part of a small partnership, come into a sum of money that was larger than anything I'd ever held in my hands before. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable in a way I had never been comfortable during my marriage. And something in me, some part of me that I'm not entirely proud of, but I'm not going to pretend wasn't real, decided that I was going to go home for that wedding. Not because I'd been invited. I hadn't been invited. I was going to go because my sons were going to be there. And because Evelyn was going to be there. And because for 22 years I had been the man who drove the truck and paid the bills and came home to silence and was never quite enough. And I wanted, just once, to walk into a room and have people see a different version of me. I want to be careful about how I say this. It wasn't revenge. I don't think it was revenge. Revenge is hot. What I felt was something cooler than that, something more patient. It was more like, you've spent your whole life being looked at a certain way, and you want one moment where the looking stops and something else happens in its place. I called a dealer in San Francisco. I had contacts there still. I arranged to have a car waiting when I landed. Not just any car. An S-Class Mercedes, silver, from a rental company that catered to people attending major events. I bought a suit from a tailor in Lyon before I left. A dark navy wool suit with a faint chalk stripe, made specifically for my body, with a cream shirt and a tie the color of old cognac. I had my shoes made, not off the shelf, made. A cobbler near the cathedral had done them over 2 weeks, dark oxblood leather, hand-stitched. I'm not a vain man. I want to say that, and I want you to believe it, and I also want to acknowledge that everything I just described sounds like the actions of a vain man. Maybe the truth is that I wasn't vain until I had something to be vain about. Or maybe the truth is that I'd suppressed something in myself for so long that when it finally came out, it came out dressed. I flew back in on a Thursday. The wedding was Saturday. I stayed at a hotel downtown. Not the most expensive hotel in the city, but close to it. I had a room on the 14th floor with a view of the bay. I ordered room service and sat at the window and watched the lights on the water and thought about Evelyn on her wedding night and wondered if she was happy and wondered if happy was even the right word for what people felt at our age when they made these choices. I slept better than I expected. Friday, I walked around the old neighborhood. Nobody recognized me at first. I'd lost some weight in France. I carried myself differently. Years of walking those cobblestone streets, years of sitting in cafes without hurrying anywhere, years of not having anything to prove to anyone. I moved differently. I knew it. I could feel it in my own body. I stopped in front of the old house. Our house. Her house now. Gerald Whitmore's car was in the driveway. A BMW, dark blue, clean. Nice car. Good car. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house, and I thought about the kitchen and the way the morning light came through the back window in September, and I thought about the boys running in the yard, and I thought about Evelyn laughing at something on the television, a real laugh, the kind that made her whole face change. I stood there for maybe 3 minutes. Then I got back in the Mercedes and drove to the hotel. Saturday morning, I dressed slowly. The suit fit exactly the way the tailor had promised. The shoes were everything. I'm not going to be modest about this. I looked at myself in that hotel mirror, and I didn't recognize the man looking back at me immediately. And then I did. And I thought, there you are. Where have you been? I drove to the venue. I wasn't on the guest list. I knew that. I parked the car where people arriving for the wedding would walk past it. That was deliberate. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. Then I walked to the entrance, and I spoke to the young woman at the door, and I told her I was the father of 2 of the groomsmen, and I was just there to see my boys for a few minutes before the ceremony started, and she, bless her, waved me through without checking anything. I walked into the room where the wedding party was gathered, and the first face I saw was Marcus. He stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked at me like I was something that had appeared from somewhere outside the laws of physics. I said, "Hello, son." He said, "Pop." "What, when did you, how are you here?" I said, "I came for the wedding, came to see you both." And then Darnell came around from the other side of the room, and he stopped too. And his eyes went from my face to the suit, to the shoes, and back to my face. And I saw something pass through him that I hadn't expected. Not just surprise. Something more like wonder. I want to be honest about what it felt like to be looked at that way by my sons. It felt like medicine. Not medicine that cures something. Medicine that makes the pain bearable for a while. I embraced them both. I told them they looked handsome. They did. They were grown men now, Marcus 43, Darnell 41, and they stood in their rented tuxedos, and they looked like their grandfather, and they looked like me, and they looked like men I was proud of despite everything. And then Evelyn walked in. She was with her bridesmaids, and she was wearing the dress, and her hair was done, and she looked, I'll say it plainly, she looked beautiful, 60 years old, and beautiful in the way that some women get more beautiful as they age, not in spite of the years, but because of them, because of what the years put in the eyes and the set of the shoulders and the quiet authority of the face. She saw me. She stopped. The room around us kept moving. Somebody was adjusting a boutonniere. Somebody was laughing at something. But she and I were very still. She said, "Clarence." I said, "Evelyn, congratulations." And then Gerald Whitmore walked up behind her. Let me tell you about Gerald Whitmore. He was a tall man, light-skinned, well-built for his age, late 50s I'd guess. He had on a tuxedo that fit him well, and cufflinks that caught the light and the easy confidence of a man who had never had to wonder whether the lights would stay on. He looked at me with that particular expression that successful men sometimes wear when they encounter someone they haven't been briefed about, a kind of careful, assessing politeness. He said, "I don't think we've met." I said, "No, we haven't. I'm Clarence, Marcus and Darnell's father." And I watched something move across his face. Recognition, recalibration. He said, "Oh, yes? Well, good to have you here." I shook his hand. His handshake was good. I'll give him that. Now, this is the part I've thought about more than any other part. This is the part I've examined from every angle I know how to examine something. A few minutes passed. People talked. The atmosphere was warm, celebratory. And Evelyn was standing a few feet away, and she was looking at me in a way she hadn't looked at me in years. Longer than years. She was looking at me the way people look at something they hadn't thought about in a long time, and then suddenly thought about. And someone, I don't remember who, one of the bridesmaids, said something along the lines of, "Evelyn was perfectly calm, perfectly quiet." Not was perfectly calm, perfectly quiet, not loud, not theatrical. Just clear the way. Clear water is clear. I said, "She deserves every happiness." She always did. I just wasn't the man who could see that clearly enough to do something about it when I had the time. And then I looked at Evelyn and I said, "You look beautiful. I hope today is everything you imagined." And I turned to Marcus and Darnell and I said, "I'm proud of you both. More than I've ever been able to say properly. More than I've known how to say. I'm sorry it took me this long to look the part of the man who raised you." And then I said to Gerald, "Take care of them. Take care of all of them. They're worth it." And I walked out. I want to tell you what I was thinking as I walked to that car. I was thinking about a Tuesday morning in 1987, when Marcus was 7 years old, and he'd had a nightmare, and I was home for once, and he'd come padding down the hall in his pajamas and climbed into bed between me and Evelyn, and I'd put my arm around him without even fully waking up, just automatically, because he was there, and I was his father, and that was what you did. I was thinking about that. I was not thinking about the car or the suit or any of it. I drove back to the hotel. I sat by the window. I ordered some tea, and I drank it, and I watched the water, and I felt something that was not quite peace but was in the same family as peace, something quieter than joy, something older than victory. The next 5 days passed slowly. I was staying through the following week before my flight back to Lyon. I walked. I visited places. I ate at a restaurant I used to love. I called my cousin and told him things had gone all right. He laughed and said, "Clarence, you've always been all right. You just didn't know it." And then on the 5th day, my phone rang. It was a number I still had saved. Evelyn Marie. I looked at it for a long time. 3, 4 rings. Long enough that I thought it would go to voicemail. I answered. She said, "Clarence." I said, "Evelyn." There was a pause, a long one, the kind she used to do when she was working herself up to something. She said, "You looked good on Saturday." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You looked like." She paused again. She said, "You looked like the man I always thought you could be." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I think I always was that man, Evelyn. I just had to go somewhere else to find him." She said, "I know." And then she said something I wasn't expecting. She said, "I think I made a mistake." And I felt the world shift under me, just slightly, the way the earth shifts in a small tremor, not enough to knock anything over, but enough that you know it happened. I said, "Evelyn, you just got married 5 days ago." She said, "I know that." I said, "You have a life." She said, "I know that, too." I said, "What do you want me to say?" She said, "I don't know. I just needed to hear your voice." And we talked for a long time after that. I won't tell you everything we said, because some of it was private in a way that feels too private, even for this. But I'll tell you that somewhere, in the middle of that conversation, I started to cry a little, not dramatically, not the way people cry in movies, just quietly, the way old men cry when something is too big to hold without leaking. I said, "Evelyn, I can't come back and fix what broke between us. That's not what that was on Saturday. That wasn't me saying I was coming back." She said, "I know." I said, "I live in France now." She said, "I know that too." I said, "What are you looking for?" She said, "I'm not sure. Maybe just to know that you're okay." I said, "I'm okay." She said, "Are you happy?" And I thought about that for a while before I answered. I said, "I'm peaceful. I don't know that it's the same thing, but I'm more peaceful than I've ever been in my life." She said, "Good. That's good, Clarence." We said goodbye, and I hung up, and I sat there in that hotel room and thought about 22 years, about Marcus at 7 years old in his pajamas, about Evelyn washing a plate, about the truck on a dark highway at 3 in the morning with the radio low and the whole country spread out dark around me, all those sleeping houses, all those lives I drove past, all those families arranged inside walls I'd never see. I thought about Lyon in October. I thought about the lavender fields from the back seat of my cousin's car. I thought about the cobbler who made my shoes and the way he'd handled the leather like it was something almost sacred. I thought about Darnell saying that word, present, the way it landed. And I thought about the oldest truth I know, which is that you spend your whole life becoming someone, and by the time you've finished becoming, most of the people you wanted to show it to have already written their version of you in permanent ink. I flew back to Lyon the following Tuesday. The city was the same. The cobblestones were the same. The refrigerator hummed the same. The neighbor's dog barked twice. Marcus called about 2 weeks after I got back. "Just to check in," he said. We talked for a while. He didn't mention the wedding much. He said, "That was something, you showing up like that." I said, "I just wanted to see you." He said, "I know. But it was," he paused. "It was good to see you like that, Pop." I said, "Like what?" He said, "I don't know how to say it exactly. Just like yourself." I let that sit. I said, "I'm working on it." He said, "Yeah, We talked for another few minutes about nothing much. His job, the weather. Before he hung up, he said, "You gonna come back sometime? Maybe Christmas?" I said, "Maybe." "We'll see." He said, "Okay. Take care of yourself." I said, "You too, son." And that was that. I want to tell you something about regret, about what it actually is, not what people say it is. People say regret is about the past, but that's not quite right. Regret is actually about the present. It's the present tense experience of knowing that the past was different from what it needed to be. It lives right now, in the chest, in the body, in the early morning hours when the room is dark and the refrigerator hums and you're 81 years old and the ice in your glass has melted to nothing. I don't know if I did the right thing at that wedding. I don't know if it was dignity or theatre. I don't know if what I said to my sons was what they needed to hear or what I needed to say. I don't know if Evelyn calling was grief or genuine reconsideration or just the particular loneliness of a newly married woman who looked across her wedding night and thought about a different version of her life. I don't know. I know that Darnell called me the following spring, and he sounded different on the phone. Warmer somehow, like something had shifted. He told me about his new job, about the woman he was seeing, about a book he'd read that he thought I'd like. He talked to me for almost an hour. I can't remember the last time, before that he'd talked to me for almost an hour. I know that I still have the suit in my closet here in Lyon. I take it out sometimes and look at it. Not to wear, just to look at. I know that Evelyn is still married to Gerald Whitmore, as far as I know. I have no reason to think otherwise. I hope she is. I hope it is good and warm and steady, and that he is present in all the ways I wasn't. That's not performance. I've had years to sit with it, and I believe it. I know that Lyon in the spring is something I can't describe well enough to do justice to. I know that I eat my bread slowly now, and I walk without hurrying, and sometimes I sit in a chair near the window and watch the street below, and I feel something moving through me that might be contentment. I know that some days the weight of it all, the 22 years, the absences, the things I didn't say in time, the boys I raised at a distance, the man I became too late, some days that weight sits right on my sternum, and I just have to let it sit there until it lifts on its own. I know that it always lifts. Eventually, I know that being an old man is a strange thing. You've survived yourself. You've outlasted your own mistakes in the sense that they're done, they're historical, they're no longer actively happening. But you also have to carry them every day because they're part of everything that came after. The boys I raised, the men they became, the way Marcus looked at me in that room, the way Darnell said the word present on the phone without knowing how it would land. All of that is still happening in some sense. The past doesn't stop moving. That's the thing nobody tells you. You think at my age you'll have processed things. You think the dust will have settled. But the dust just arranges itself differently. The light hits it differently, depending on the season and the time of day, and what you had for breakfast, and whether the neighbor's dog is barking or not. I think about Evelyn sometimes in the mornings, just briefly. I think about the kitchen with the morning light coming through the back window. I think about the way she used to hum when she was washing dishes, not singing, just humming, like the music was something happening in her body that she wasn't quite aware of. I think about driving that truck at 3 in the morning with the whole country dark around me. All those sleeping houses, all those lives arranged behind those walls, I used to wonder what those lives were like. I used to look at a lit window in a dark building at 2 in the morning, just one light on in the whole building, and think about who was awake and why and what they were thinking about. Whether they were happy, whether they were lonely, whether they'd made the choices they'd meant to make. I'm the one light now, awake at 2 in the morning with the ice melted in my glass. Thinking. Just thinking. Marcus calls more than he used to. I don't know if that's because of the wedding, because of something that shifted that day, or because he's getting older too and starting to feel the particular urgency that comes with understanding that time is actually moving in one direction. Maybe both. Probably both. I don't ask. I just answer the phone when he calls, and I talk to him for as long as he wants to talk. And when he says goodbye, I hold the phone for a moment after and feel something warm in my hands from where the phone was. Darnell got married, his own wedding, 2 years ago. He called me 2 months beforehand and asked me to be there. Just asked me, simply, no drama. Said, "Pop, I want you to come. I want you at my wedding." I said, "Son, there's nothing in this world that could keep me from it." I flew back. I wore the same suit, different tie, a softer one. I stood in the back of the room because I wasn't in the wedding party. I was just the father of the groom, standing in the back of the room watching his son get married. And when Darnell came down the aisle with his bride, he looked out into the crowd and he found my face, and he held it for a moment. He held my face, not his mother's, not Gerald's, not anyone else's, mine. And he smiled. And I thought, okay, that's something. That's not everything, but that's something. I'm not going to tell you that moment fixed everything that was broken. I'm not going to tell you that it made the absences not happen, or the silences not happen, or the years of being gone more than I was present. I'm not going to tell you that. But I'm going to tell you that when my son looked out across a room full of people on the most important day of his life, and he found my face, something in me that had been clenched for a very long time loosened just slightly, just a fraction, like a knot that you've worked at for years, and one day you work at it again, and something gives. Just a little. Just enough. I've been sitting here so long now. The room is the same quiet it was when I started talking. The refrigerator still hums. The neighbor's dog has been still for hours. The street outside is empty. Lyon at 2 in the morning is a very quiet city. I'm 81 years old. I drove a truck for 16 years, and I was gone more than I was home, and I was married for 22 years, and I divorced, and I got on a plane and flew 9,000 miles away, and I showed up at my ex-wife's wedding in a suit that was made for my body, and shoes that were made for my feet, and I said what I had to say, and I walked out, and 5 days later she called me. And none of that is the story. The story is the kitchen with the morning light. The story is Marcus at 7 years old in his pajamas. The story is Darnell saying that word, present, and not knowing what it cost me to hear it. The story is the lavender fields from the back seat of my cousin's car, the way they went purple all the way to the horizon, the way I cried quietly so they wouldn't see. The story is the cobbler who made my shoes and handled the leather like it was sacred. The story is this chair, this room, this glass of water that used to have ice in it. The story is still happening. I don't know how it ends. I don't know that stories like this one end. I think they just get quieter, like a river getting wider as it moves toward the sea, spreading out, slowing down. The water the same water it always was, but spread thin now, across a wider bed, moving slower, catching the light differently. I think that's what this is. I'm spread thin now. I'm moving slow. I'm catching the light differently than I used to.